Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us today to the Academic Resources Conference. My name is Beth Ryan. I am the Senior Director over Benefits and Payroll Data Operations at the Office of the Chancellor. And I'd like to introduce my co-host, Dustin.
Hi, my name is Dustin May. I'm in the Office of General Counsel. I am Campus Counsel for Humboldt State University, and I'm one of the Wage and Hour Specialists in the Office of General Counsel.
And today we will be talking to you about independent contractors. And the title of our presentation today is Sharing Employees Across Campuses, the Nuts and Bolts. But in parens, why not independent contractors? And Dustin and I are going to be talking about, Dustin will be talking about the legal aspects of independent contracting. And I will be talking about those nuts and bolts that all of you are looking forward to hearing about. But what we wanted to do, and I want to hand it over to Dustin, is, when we work at a campus and we do our operational jobs, it helps us to understand the why of what we do, and not just the how, but the why. And so Dustin's here today to talk about the why and why we can't just hire independent contractors for all the work we do. Why not? It'd be a lot easier. We don't have to go through the hiring process, or we don't have to, do recruitment and I-9s. But Dustin's going to tell us to, kind of hold off, and let's take a look at why we actually can't be bringing on independent contractors to make it easier. So Dustin, I'm handing it off to you.
All right, thanks, Beth. And so for my portion of the presentation, the goal of my conversation with you is to give you a very general overview of the legal framework behind independent contractor classification, as that framework serves as the basis for CSU policy on the issue. So hopefully this discussion will really put CSU policy in context for all of you. And independent contractor classification starts with the basic principle that when a hiring entity brings on a worker, there are two buckets that the worker can fall in. That worker can be classified as either an employee or an independent contractor. And the law presumes, unless the hiring entity demonstrates otherwise, that the worker is an employee. So how does the hiring entity demonstrate that? Well, the determination of whether that worker is an employee or an independent contractor is determined by both federal and state laws. And there's a whole web of laws that apply to this determination that make it very complex. There are federal and state statutes, there are regulations, and court cases that all help inform this analysis. And so from those sources, there are a number of factors, some of which we'll go into briefly, that need to be considered as part of this determination of whether to classify a worker as an employee or an independent contractor. But before going on, I want to highlight a basic principle of this issue, which is that it's an either-or situation. A worker is either an employee or an independent contractor. An individual cannot be both an employee and an independent contractor for the same employee at the same time. So as I mentioned before, there are a number of different tests and rules governing the determination of whether a worker is classified or may be classified as an independent contractor. And this can make compliance very challenging. You can have situations where a worker may be properly classified as an independent contractor under federal law, but under more restrictive state law in California, that worker would be an employee and can only be classified as an employee. So in that case, it doesn't do any good to classify that worker as an independent contractor, since the hiring entity would be violating state law. So with all the competing standards and rules, the CSU has adopted a single test for determining whether a worker can be classified as an independent contractor. And that test is the one adopted by the California Supreme Court in 2018 in a case called Dynamex. And as I'll get into shortly, it's a very strict employee-friendly standard, meaning that it's very difficult to properly classify a worker as an independent contractor. And with how strict the standard is, if a worker is an independent contractor under the Dynamex test, for all intents and purposes, they'll be an independent contractor under all other laws. So to yield a result that complies with all applicable classification rules, the CSU adopted the Dynamex test for independent contractor classification. So what is this case? Well, not to bore you all too much of the legal history behind it, but this 2018 case from the California Supreme Court was really a game changer. Prior to this decision, the standards in California for independent contractor classification were less clear, but the analysis was a little more flexible. There were a couple competing tests, and one of the primary tests, referred to as the Borello test, which is the name of the court case that the test took its name from. This Borello test looked at over a dozen different factors and was more of a holistic analysis, which gave hiring entities and workers a little more flexibility into entering an independent contractor relationship. And to be sure, it was still difficult to properly classify someone as an independent contractor, but that analysis, again, was a little more flexible than the Dynamex test. So in 2018, the California Supreme Court was asked to decide, well, what's the applicable standard? We need to decide this once and for all. How do we determine when a worker could be properly classified as an independent contractor? Well, that case arose out of a dispute over one area of California employment law, and the California Supreme Court threw everyone a curveball and adopted a test from Massachusetts, a test referred to as the ABC test, and said that that test is the one that applies for this particular area of California employment law that was at issue in the Dynamex case. So what is that test? Well, it's up for you on the screen here, and it says, a worker shall be considered an employee unless the person is free from the control and direction of the hiring entity in connection with the performance of the work. The person performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business, and the person is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business. So I want to break this down just a little more so you can kind of get an understanding of what these elements are really getting at. Now, notice that the test starts with that presumption that I mentioned earlier. The worker must be considered an employee unless the hiring entity establishes all three things. So the burden is on the hiring entity to establish all three of those elements that you see on the screen in front of you. So that first element, we're looking at control and direction. And what this means is that the hiring entity must not be able to control or direct what the worker does, either by contract or in actual practice. So even if the independent contractor agreement says that the CSU or the hiring entity does not control the means of the work, but in actuality that worker has an on-site supervisor that is with the hiring entity or the CSU, that's going to conflict with what that first element requires. So we're going to be looking at things like, is the hiring entity telling the person exactly how to do the job, giving them a strict work schedule, gives them a uniform to wear, exercising close supervision, things like that. That second element on there, and this is really the big one, looking at whether the person performs work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. And the California Supreme Court gave a few examples to crystallize this rule and what they're really getting at here. So, for example, a plumber that's brought in to fix a retail store's plumbing would be most likely an independent contractor, since that plumber is acting outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. But another example, a cake decorator that's brought into a bakery would very likely not be an independent contractor. Or a software engineer hired to help other developers finish a project at a database company would also likely not be an independent contractor. And the new tech letter that Beth will get into a little bit later gives a few other examples that are a little more pertinent to the CSU. So, for example, a campus cannot hire faculty in counseling to work as an independent contractor for the purposes of conflict resolution, or hire instructors to teach a certificate program as independent contractors. Nor could a campus hire an independent contractor to perform IT services that are already being performed by campus staff. So as you kind of see what these examples show is that this element really puts a big limit on the type of work that an independent contractor can do. And this third element here, looking at whether the person is customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, or business, factors relevant to this determination include whether the worker or the business is incorporated or licensed, whether the worker advertises their services. Do they have a website? Do they have a business card? Are they offering their services to the general public or other potential customers? Or is this person really just working with the hiring entity alone? And it's important to note that this is really an all or nothing test. The failure to establish any of these elements means that the individual must be classified as an employee under this Dynamex test. And it's important to note and also remember that the burden is on the hiring entity to establish all three of these elements. So what happened after this decision? Well, the Dynamex case came down in April 2018, and there was some confusion over when to use that test and what areas of law it covered, since the decision was, again, just a court case, the California Supreme Court case, but it only involved one aspect of California employment law. So there was some confusion. Okay, well, does it apply to other areas of California employment law or not? Well, the legislature curbed that confusion by passing Assembly Bill 5, which codified the Dynamex decision in statute and clarified the decision's application to various areas of California law, including the California Labor Code, the California Wage Orders, and the Unemployment Insurance Code. And what Assembly Bill 5 also did was create a number of exceptions to when the Dynamex decision would not apply and when that other test that I mentioned earlier, the Borrello test, would apply. I'm not going to get into those in detail today, but the tech letter that just came out in April 2021 does discuss these new exceptions, the exceptions that are part of AB5, and also a new law that came out last year. It does discuss those exceptions in summary form, so you can see if any of those may be relevant to decisions being made on your campus in this area. And next, I want to just briefly touch base on the conflict of interest rules. These interplay with the independent contractor issues and are also discussed in the HR tech letter, the one in 2019, and also the one that was updated that just came out. These conflict of interest rules and our obligations are found in the Public Contract Code, sections 10831 and 10832. And generally, what they provide is that while they prohibit campuses from contracting with current or recently separated CSU employees. So if you remember what I said earlier in that the law prohibits employees from being categorized both as an employee and independent contractor, well, there's another layer of that for the CSU, in that we have a public contract code and conflict of interest rules that also prohibit this. And 10831 even more specifically says, prohibits the CSU from engaging its employees with other work that is outside the scope of their regular duties. And it also provides, and this next section has created a little bit of confusion, says that no officer or employee in the CSU shall contract on his or her own individual behalf as an independent contractor with any CSU department to provide goods or services. And this next part, and it's in highlights here for you, this section shall not apply to officers or employees of the CSU with teaching or research responsibilities. And this is the part that's created a little bit of confusion. So I'll go to the next slide and just try to hopefully alleviate some of this confusion. So some campuses have interpreted that last part, that last exception, is meaning that employees with teaching or research responsibilities, i.e. faculty, may always be engaged as independent contractors, meaning that that restriction on contracting just doesn't apply to faculty. Well, that's not really what the intent of that section is. If you look at the tech letter has some language in there. It's noted as restriction 1 on the slide, and it phrases it how we should all be thinking about it, in that a CSU employee, except for those employees with teaching or research responsibilities, may not contract on his or her individual behalf as an independent contractor with any CSU department. But what that means is that, when you look at that last bullet on the slide, campuses may engage with those employees with teaching or research responsibilities as independent contractors, but that doesn't get rid of the general prohibition about independent contractor classification. So campuses may engage with employees with teaching or research responsibilities as independent contractors, provided that the individual still qualifies as an independent contractor under applicable law. And so, as we talked about, whether someone can be properly classified as an independent contractor has become a whole lot more difficult over the last few years. And so we should not be looking at this exception as some sort of lifeline to broadly classifying folks with teaching or research responsibilities as independent contractors. There's still a whole second analysis that campuses would need to go through and comply with before that person could properly be classified as an independent contractor. So what's the big deal? Well, not only is, the CSU and hiring entities, we all want to do the right thing, but also federal and state law impose very significant consequences for independent contractor misclassification. That liability starts with wage liability, including overtime. Because again, if the person was misclassified as an independent contractor, then that means that they're subject and they should have been subject to laws pertaining to employees, like minimum wage and overtime. So depending on the hours worked and the pay arrangement, the hiring entity may have liability for minimum wage and overtime violations. If that person is also an employee, there may be benefit liability, including retirement. There's also all sorts of statutory penalties, including waiting time penalties for the failure to pay wages, on time failure to timely pay final wages, and those penalties can add up very quickly. There's also risk of losing reimbursement under federal contract and grant funds. There are federal laws and regulations regarding independent contractor misclassification, and so we need to be cognizant of those, of what the effect would be for our federal contracts and grants. And also state and federal tax penalties. As you might imagine, if you're paying someone on a 1099, they should have been paid on a W-2. There are all sorts of tax consequences to that, and related penalties that may be issued for a misclassified employee. And the California government is not messing around on this. As I mentioned, after that Dynamex case, that was really sort of a sea change with independent contractor classification. The California government passed Assembly Bill 5 in 2019, and they passed another bill last year on this issue. And the governor has been increasing the budget in this area to increase the workload related to misclassification. You can see on the slide here that the budget for last year included an additional $17.5 million for the Department of Industrial Relations to increase workload in this area. So it's definitely an area that has become a high area of focus for the California government and the related employment enforcement agencies, and so in turn should be a high area of focus for the CSU to ensure that we're doing everything that we need to be so we can be compliant with our obligations under both state and federal law. And so with that, that wraps up sort of the legal portion here and the legal overview. I hope that provided a good understanding of where the basis for our CSU policy and where it came from. And with that, I will turn it over to Beth for the remaining portion of the presentation.
All right, thank you, Destin. So what we're going to do next, after hearing all of the legal support around independent contractors, that covers actually what I mentioned earlier at the very beginning of the presentation. It covers the why, and it's pretty heavy. There are a lot of laws surrounding independent contracting, not only with the federal side, with the government, with the IRS, but it's also with the state. And the legislation that's coming out these days, it only puts additional layers on what we need to do. So what I have heard from you in the past in this group on the academic side and also on the staff and management side is, where is this coming from? Why is this started? How do we ramp this up? And there are answers to this, and then there's some answers we need to work through. And independent contracting rules have been out, quote, so to speak, out there for quite a long time, but they're getting more and more onerous, and campuses are at different stages of where they need to be in terms of identifying what is an independent contractor and what is an employee. And so what we're going to do on this second section of this presentation is talk about the operational component of this. All right, what do we do with the information that Dustin just offloaded on us? Well, you're not alone. So you all that are listening to this today, you're not alone. You do not feel that you're burdened with all of this. It takes a village, and it takes a village at the chancellor's office. It takes a village at your campus to help and support you through this. And some of the folks that on your campus that will help and support you with this is certainly your academic affairs office, your AVP on the academic affairs side, the HR AVP on the staff and management side, their collaboration. Also your contracts office, they have a major piece in helping determine this. Also, sometimes accounts payable gets involved, and then of course payroll gets involved because payroll, for the most part, will be handling most of the hires. Because let's face it, bringing someone in as an independent contractor is extremely rare. And so most of the time you'll be working with employees on trying to slot in some of the work that you need to bring on. And so for the rest of this presentation, I want to cover the technical letter, and Dustin alluded to it, HR Salary 2021-07. And then we want to talk a little bit about employees working at multiple campuses. I know this is something, and this is really the heart of this presentation and what you've been waiting for on the edge of your seat. And then also I want to talk about a case study. What are we doing out there right now? And then at the end, I want to just kind of capture some resources, references, and contacts for you. And I've kind of mentioned that already in terms of it takes a village. So you will need to have all of those people, if you haven't done it yet on your campus, kind of together to help you out with this. So as I go through, so on the slide, it states technical letter HR salary 2021-07. I just want to start out by saying this one is, we actually supersede another technical letter we posted in 2019. So the majority of the information in this technical letter has already been out there. Dustin did allude to some recent legislative action that we needed to kind of update in our technical letter. And I do want to just have you take a look at the technical letter and look at it. There are additional layers as to what there might be with it, regards to exceptions. But what I want to at least let you know is those exceptions that are called out in that technical letter are pretty complex. So I would refer to your academic affairs office, your AVP, or either your general counsel from the chancellor's office to kind of identify if some of these exceptions that have been called out recently under AB 2257 would apply. But in general, I would not worry too much. There is a template form on determining what is an independent contractor versus an employee. And I would walk through that with that village that you're working with to make those determinations. So the technical letter basically continues to provide independent contractor guidelines, and that is how to determine IC status, the limitations, the faculty considerations, which you're all interested in, and conflict of interest and documentation. So the tech letter goes through all of that. And for the most part, if I wanted to walk through, or if I do, I will, and forgive me for looking over on my screen, I am referring to the new tech letter. And within that tech letter, it gives what we call, there's a guidance or guidelines that we provide. And within those guidelines, we have an introduction, which basically kind of gives you a definition of independent contractor versus employee. And it stresses that most of your hires or the work that you do on campus are employee-based. So basically says, hire everybody as an employee, except for those small exceptions. And then it also kind of calls out the penalties. And then we talk about the procedures also. What do you do to bring on someone that may in fact actually be an independent contractor? You may actually determine that. And it goes into the procedures. And then of all, we work for a huge organization, the bureaucracy. So you got forms. You're going to have to fill out forms. And then we have various references within the guide. And then we have an appendix, Assembly Bill 2257, Appendix B, Contract Code, the Public Contract Code, those restrictions that Dustin was mentioning, about hiring somebody as a independent contractor after they actually leave service. And I know you've been asking also about, can you actually bring somebody on the foundation side as an independent contractor? Or do funds matter? What funding source? So we'll get to that in this discussion. Finally, Appendix C, Campus Independent Contractor Request and Determination Form. This is the optional template that your campus can use. My guess is there's someone already using it. It's going to be different at each campus. I used to work at Cal State Long Beach, and yay for me, I used to be over this particular section or over independent contractors, and I was over benefits and payroll. So the payroll section, we kind of coordinated it, but again, our village was everybody else I mentioned earlier at the beginning of this talk. We were just not siloed. This is a kind of process that cannot be siloed. So let's go to the next. So The tech letter is really what I'm going to urge you all to take a look at. The process, the procedures that you're working from. First you got to take a look at the Dynamics test and make sure what applies to the Dynamics test. You have to go through your approval document, and then you can engage your independent contractor. But if you can engage the independent contractor and you determine maybe this work is not independent contractor work, then you have to step back and take a look at how you bring them on and hire them. So again, I urge you to take a very good look at the tech letter. I would, even depending on where your campus is, urge your AVP to schedule meetings and kind of talk about this process, and liaison with your HR office and your contracts and procurement office, as well as your AP office. So if we're going to move from the tech letter, let's take a look at some of those questions that you had initially that you wanted to speak to. So employees working at multiple campuses. So if we take a step back, you now realize that maybe for some of us on certain campuses, the practice of bringing on an independent contractor to do some of the services is not going to work, because you filled out your form and your template and you followed the rules and you're following the tech letter, and you go, oh, wow, this is work that's normally done by an employee. This individual that we want to bring on is actually an employee at another campus. And I think this is where you want to do some focusing. So we'll talk about this. So, an individual hired as a CSU employee should not be paid as an independent contractor at the same time. Now, Dustin said, and he referred to that public contract code and kind of that nuance, which we were following for a long time. If you're faculty and you have teaching or grant related responsibilities, then you're exempt and you can hire as an independent contractor. And I think many of us at campuses did that. And, to be totally honest with you, it was very easy for me to do. It was much easier to bring on an independent contractor than to go through that entire process of hiring someone, I-9ing them, having them sit down and fill out paperwork for 45 minutes for them to actually do one day's worth of work. Believe me, I understand. It's a lot easier than hiring someone. But unfortunately, after you go through the steps that are in the technical letter, you'll probably find that you won't be able to do that. And you'll have to kind of find ways to not get around it, but to comply with the law. So my recommendation is, for the most part, view everyone that works at a campus elsewhere, and even for the state of California, we're considered one employer. View them as having to be an employee. They're never going to be an independent contractor. Don't even try. Just assume they're going to have to be an employee. So in the bullets here I have, the CSU in the state of California must be treated as a single employer. In other words, an individual employed at a campus or state agency who seeks to perform services at another campus or state agency cannot be an independent contractor at the campus or state agency. So I know I probably will repeat myself a couple times through the rest of this presentation, but it is extremely important. Think of it this way. You don't want an employee receiving a 1099 at the same time they're receiving a W-2. That's the easiest way to remember it. The second bullet, campus auxiliaries may use the information contained in the tech letter as a reference. Auxiliaries must look to their legal counsel to ensure proper application of the laws and the Dynamics court case. And, even though it seems to us sometimes that state employment and employment with our auxiliaries sometimes just kind of mirror, they kind of run together, so to speak. They are different employers, but we have to make sure that the work that's being done, and if in fact the employee is working both on the state side and on the foundation side, that in almost all cases they should be employed as an employer on both sides. And that work needs to be separate. We do not want an employee performing job duties in the foundation that should be actually on the state side. So it can be pretty precarious. Sometimes it's easy to default and implement workarounds just to make work easier. But it's better to put in the work at the beginning and do it the right way than to have to deal with the consequences later on during an audit or a finding. So as Dustin said in his presentation, there are some strict penalties. And from my experience, where we find this to be an issue is if we hire an individual as an independent contractor, work them for a period of time, and they start feeling that they should be an employee, and likely case they probably should be. And they're going to come back and say, hey, you should have brought me into membership with CalPERS. You should have been paying my Social Security because I've been having to pay the employer and the employee side. And then there's penalties to go along with it. And it's a lot, I'm going to call it a time suck. So better to do the work on the front end than to get caught up in the back end, because I've seen it happen and it's no fun. So while we're still talking about working at multiple campuses, let's talk about the examples. Earlier, just in the slide before, I was kind of just talking about, who is an independent contractor, who isn't, and why we can't hire someone as an independent contractor who works at another campus. Let's actually look at some of the things that go on out there, and I'm sure you're all familiar with it because you wouldn't be asking for this talk if you weren't. So part-time work at 2 campuses. So we all know we call them, what do we call them? Our frequent flyers, our lecturers. And they instruct under contract, and they can do this at multiple campuses. And we know in the Southern California area and up near the Bay Area, where we have all of our campuses very close to each other, our lecturers can be hired. Well, normally it's at two different campuses, but I suspect it could be more. And we'd have someone, for instance, working at Northridge, teaching a class or two, and then driving down the 710 freeway to go to Dominguez Hills in the afternoon to teach another class or 2 classes, up to full time. Usually lecturers aren't full time, but on rare occasions that does happen. But they're at 2 different campuses, and that is always a separate appointment. So that lecturer not only has to I-9, fill out all the paperwork at the one campus, they have to do the same at the second campus. And additional workload for lecturers is you have to use assigned time. So that's the other example. So besides lecturers being hired at 2 campuses to teach a couple courses, sometimes when they're doing additional workload for these lecturers, you use assigned time, and there's some discussion between campuses as to how that works. Now, for full-time, and it's usually our tenure track, the additional employment. So someone who's a tenure track is working full-time, and they are at one campus, and maybe another campus wants to use them for another function. Now, what gets a little interesting is oftentimes these faculty don't even tell the campus where their primary appointment sits. And that can get kind of interesting. And that's probably around the guest lecturer and then maybe the academic program review. Oftentimes that doesn't happen, but we know, if we're familiar with the collective bargaining agreement for CFA, I think their campus where they have their primary appointment is supposed to know when they have additional employment. And it doesn't always happen. And because it doesn't always happen, and we'll talk about it in the next slide or two, is how that employee is to get paid. And then there's also on the first bullet is the campus grants and non-instructional work. That happens too, and it happens at another campus. And those are the 3 big reasons, I think, where you'll have a full-time faculty member working at one campus and then doing additional work above the 1.0 at another campus. The other situation, which would be more widely known between the 2 campuses, is what we would call a buyout or assigned time of faculty. So you're all familiar with it. You've got a faculty member that's working at your campus, and it happens with the chancellor's office, and that'll be the case study where the chancellor's office says, hey, faculty A, you've got some great expertise in this area, and we have some funding for a project that we've been given by the governor, and we need your expertise to work at the chancellor's office. So there's some discussion with the campus and the chancellor's office, and maybe there's a solution where some of that time is bought out. So the faculty member may still be 1.0, and working at that primary campus, but they're not performing full 100% duties of that 1.0 because they're doing some additional work for the chancellor's office. And there is a process that has recently been, I would say, codified not too long ago, and we'll actually speak to it in the case study I referenced. Now, the last example are awards. It's either on the same campus or system-wide. And one example is the Faculty Innovation and Leadership Awards, and that's usually centralized funds that are going out to faculty that are performing above standard, come up with something new, invent them, show great leadership, and they're awarded those funds. Those funds cannot be paid through accounts payable either. They have to be paid through payroll. And everything here that we're listing as examples are run through payroll. None of these should be run through what I would call a 1099. Now, and I say that that's pretty black and white. None of them should. And I know and I recognize that there is a considerable amount of work that would be involved for adhering to everything on here. Certainly not the very first two bullets under part-time at the campuses, but when we start looking at the rest of these bullets, I know and I understand and recognize being trying to adhere to everything we're telling you today is quite onerous and challenging. Now, on the next slide, we want to talk about how does this work? How do we do this? Two separate hires. So as the lecturer example went, that's an easy one. So the lecturer's working part-time at one campus and part-time for another campus. These are two separate hires. We see, even though CSU is one entity, and we see it to some degree really one employer, we have agencies, and each agency is our campus. And in order for an employee to be hired at a campus, we actually have to hire them as if they were individual employers. So employees are hired at each campus, and it includes a new hire paperwork, I-9 process, and pay is actually generated at each campus. So these frequent freeway flyers actually receive two checks. And as a side note, if you've got a lecturer working in two different departments or colleges on your own campus, you're going to see the same thing. Two checks are generated. I'll thank the State Controller's Office for that one. So then there's the other example, one hire. So the one hire is at the campus where the primary appointment is held. And that's where that check is generated. Now, this is something that we are working toward to synthesize the process of what some of us say shared employees or call shared employees. So their employees are hired at one campus where the primary appointment is held. Work at secondary campuses is reimbursed via cash posting order, which I'll show you later in another slide. So if there's a buyout, then no change to employee's primary appointment assigned time is given. That's the easiest one. If additional employment or additional workload, the campus with the primary appointment would compensate the employee consistent with the existing practices on campus for the same or similar type of workload performed on the campus. So the thought there is that the employee wouldn't go to the, I would say, campus B, the other campus, and be hired by them. There's a streamlined approach to some people's thought that the primary campus that holds that appointment would pay for that work at the other campus, and that cash posting order process would take place. And that is evolving. Not every campus is doing that, and I understand the challenge you face. It's like, who do you reach out to at the other campus? How do you negotiate that? What if the other campus doesn't want to do the CPO process? How does it work then? We are right in the middle of these challenges right now. And I think you probably would appreciate and like for the chancellor's office to say, thou shall. But we're not at thou shall at the moment. We're just highly encouraging it. Maybe we'll achieve it at one time. So here's your case study. Case study, faculty engagement at the chancellor's office. And this actually just was set up. So I'm giving you kind of the lowdown of what the current agreement is right now. Additional employment for faculty who carry a 1.0 appointment. So this is the nuts and bolts of this case study. Okay, so there could be a partial buyout or assigned time for faculty who carry a 1.0 appointment. So it could be either or, buyout or additional employment. Additional workload for faculty who are part-time should be appointed using assigned time. Campus faculty perform services for the chancellor's office. And here's the rub: no independent contractor, no accounts payable 1099. And then we also recommending highly no special consultant hire for this work. And you're familiar with special consultants. It's the employee classification 4660. We want to pay an employee for the work they're doing in the right classification and in the right employee group. Scope of work is developed. So there's a discussion between the two campuses or the chancellor's office about what work is being done. So scope of work developed and approved by the campus deans and chairs or the respective colleges and departments. Funds are transferred via cash posting order from chancellor's office to where the primary appointment is held. It's at the campus. And this has been set up for all 23 campuses that participate with one contact from each campus working with the CO, Student Affairs Office. So in actuality, it's really happening. And we would like, it'd be, I think personally, it would be great if we can do this across campus too. So what the heck is a CPO, cash posting order? It's the way to move funds from one campus to the other. I know there's been some questions about how this works and how you make it happen. And there usually is a point of contact that the chancellor's office has that the campus has assigned. And it's usually in your finance area, probably in your AP office, but it could differ based on the campus structure. So my guess it would be with your finance office and department administration. I highly encourage you to click on the link and read through it because it tells you exactly what has to happen. It's kind of like a throughput. So one campus requests the funds, but you do it through a centralized process that goes through the chancellor's office and comes out the other end, and it steals money from the other campus. But of course, both of you need to agree to the process because one's not going to give up money that they don't know that you're asking for. So it demands a lot of communication. So beyond that, resources and references. So what I did was I cut out the information on the very end of the tech letter. And these are the resources that we provide for you to reference. It's pretty heavy and it kind of touches on all of the information that Dustin provided you, which gives me a headache when I listen to it. So, at your leisure, if you need to understand more information, this basically tells you how we came up with the guidance. So it's based on rules, it's based on law, it's based on regulation, it's based on policy. And it was all a collection from all of these different areas, which helped us write the guidelines. It's not just one source of information. And what we ran into when we did this was rules and laws conflicted with each other. Public contract code said, oh yeah, faculty can independent contract if they have lecturer or instructional or grant related duties. Well, okay, but you also have to comply with the rules of the IRS. So very challenging, but this is why we created the guide for you to be able to reference and for you to use. Finally, here's your village: campus HR, contract procurement office, accounts payable. And what I left off there, and most important, is your academic affairs office and the folks in your own academic personnel office. I may be using certain words or nomenclature that may not track with what you have in your academic affairs office, and my apologies. One size doesn't fit all, and hopefully you were able to decipher what I was saying. But this is your village, and again, you're not alone. You're not required to do this all on your own. It's what, it takes a lot of work. All right. So that concludes the presentation. What I'd like to do is to speak to some of the questions that have come in. And so what I will do is I'm going to go ahead and state the question, and then I will provide the answer. So here we go. So one of the questions that came in: can an employee at one campus be an independent contractor at another campus? So I think we know the answer to that one. So if you're an employee at one campus, can you be an independent contractor at the other campus? I think we know that one is no. So the next one: can an employee receive an award or honorarium paid through a 1099? I bet you all know the answer to that one because we covered that one too. Awards and honorariums for employees must be paid as compensation and wages. Okay, here's another one. What if an employee is paid from different funds? Does that matter in determining if the employee can be an independent contractor? CSU employees, regardless of the funding source, so as an example, housing, parking, continuing ed fees, may not be an employee and an independent contractor at the same time. The dynamics test and conflict of interest rules would still apply. Okay, here's another one. The Public Contract Code provides an exception for employees with teaching and research responsibilities. Can campuses hire faculty if the working is teaching and research related? Okay, I think you know this one too because we covered this one a couple times. In almost all cases, no. The Public Contract Code cannot supersede federal law, and the dynamics test and conflict of interest rules would still apply. Now, note the collective bargaining agreement for CFA between CSU and the California Faculty Association and the CSU's policy on additional employment allow for faculty unit employees to perform work paid by grants and contracts up to specified limits, including contracts the state agencies, even if such work is not substantially different from the faculty member's primary employment. So CCFA Article 36.5b. Such employment must be compensated either through CSU as a state employee or as an employee through the auxiliary, managing the contract as appropriate. So again, employee, employee, employee. All right, here's another one. Is there a system-wide requirement that mandates how campuses share employees? No, but I wish. It is simply advised that campuses work with each other to ensure continuity in employment and pay. Okay, here's another one. Can a CSU employee be paid as an independent contractor for a campus auxiliary or foundation? Well, you probably already figured that one out through some of the other questions. And dynamics tests and conflict of interest rules would still apply. Rare occasions. I actually am familiar with one campus where no, if you're an employee on the state side, we're not going to hire you as an independent contractor on the foundation side. Just too simple to say no. Okay, here's another one. Who on campus determines if the work to be performed can be conducted by an independent contractor? It's that village I've been talking to you about. It depends on the process established at the campus. Departments that typically are involved in the process include academic affairs, human resources, procurement, accounts payable, sometimes payroll. So the village. A designee should be selected on campus with authority to approve or deny the use of independent contractor. Check with your boss. Check with the AVP. Find out where that's being done. Leverage them. They're the knowledge brokers there for this. Alrighty. What if a campus wants to use the services of a faculty member at another campus? Ooh, we talked about that one. Since the campus cannot hire the faculty member as an independent contractor, the campus must either hire as a new employee or work with the campus where the primary appointment is held to share the employee. For full-time faculty, that work could be considered additional employment or a buyout with assigned time. For part-time lecturers, the work could be considered a separate appointment and a new hire or additional work as assigned time. See, so many options, so many headaches. All right, we're nearing the last of some of our questions. So, is a campus required to pay the full-time faculty member who performs work for another campus, even though the employee does not inform their campus? Well, the faculty member should not be performing services at another campus without the knowledge of the campus where the primary appointment is held. And referred to collective bargaining agreement on additional employment. All right, there is no MOU agreement between campuses or CSU policy that require the campus where the primary appointment is held to pay for the work performed at another campus. However, the Chancellor's office strongly urges campuses to work together to ensure continuity of employment and pay. See the CPO guidance on the CEO's SharePoint site, which I mentioned earlier. Well, that concludes the presentation on independent contracting, sharing employees between campuses, and the nuts and bolts. I know some of this was pretty heavy, And I'll blame Dustin on that. He got you through all of the boring, dry stuff, but it's really important because you don't want to be working on things on the back end if you didn't implement it right. So hopefully some of the talk on the operations side is a little helpful. I know we didn't have all the answers for you, and we will be talking to you further about it. This is becoming a very important topic, and Dustin and I, we are being or receiving invitations from lots of different groups on campus to speak about this. So I am sure you'll be hearing more from us. If you have any questions, please submit them through your conference team, and Dustin and I would be happy to answer those at a later time. Again, on behalf of Dustin and myself, thank you so much. Appreciate it. Take care.